So first off, there's supposed to be food here. I'm gonna have to call Kara afterwards and see what's going on. But anyway, I want to introduce Tomoko Ichikawa and her class from Institute of Design at Illinois Institute of Technology. It's a collaboration that we've done as the second one. We developed a guide for communicating the external beam radiation experience a couple of years ago, and then this was an extension on that with Yasmin Hassan, Brian Callender, who does graphic medicine, internal medicine, and it's funded by the Bucksbaum Institute. So Tomoko is a clinical professor of design at the Institute of Design. Your expertise before going into academics was communicating complex.
Simplification, so communication.
Yeah, communication simplification, which fits pretty well with radiation oncology. So. With that, I'll turn it over to Tomoko.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming today. I just wanted to give you a quick context of where this project fits within your world as well as our world. We are, as Dan mentioned, we're at the Institute of Design, not far from here at Illinois Institute of Technology. We are a graduate level design school with master's and PhD programs. We are also direct descendants of the German design school called Bauhaus, which is celebrating its centennial. And one of its main missions was to take sort of prevailing challenges of that time and find ways to humanize it. And so for them, in the early 1900s, it was about mass manufacturing and the coming industrial age. For us today, it's about harnessing complexity. What we've also done is pioneer the field of user-centered design. You might have heard the word human-centered design. I've also heard it recently called people-centered design. But the idea is to provide solutions that are focused around serving the needs of users and other stakeholders. And so in the presentation today, you'll see how we go about doing that a bit. And so the type of design that we do is very different from the kind of design that you may be familiar with. And I'm hoping that you will walk away today with a changed perception of the field of design. We work best, the type of design that we do, user-centered design works best at the intersection of everyday people's lives and the larger experiences that they're surrounded by. And in this case, it's healthcare delivery. But what you'll see is that our students, being graduate students in design, we are not artists. We are not comic designers. My students are here at the school to train to become design strategists, user researchers, user experience designers, service system designers, taking a very holistic approach to designing. You may think of design as something that's whimsical or inspiration-based, but hopefully you'll walk away today with a different understanding of what design is. So I would like to thank several people who have allowed this experience for us to happen today. Brian, Dr. Callender was the first to introduce us to Dr. Golden. We also have support from Bucksbaum Institute, so thank you for your continued support. Dr. Hassan, our expert, who we've been tapping into just till the very last minute. Thank you for your guidance. And Ritu, where's Ritu? Eagle Eye Ritu. She catches all the details, and that's what really matters on projects like this. And Dr. Golden, or we call him Dr. Dan, in our quarters. Thanks for the support and the guidance that you've given our students for this project, and we have other projects that are lined up as well, which you'll hear about. But I want to turn it over to the students now, because how many of you are medical students? Okay, so you know that the real work is done by you guys, and that's the same for me. So I'm going to move out of the way, and do you want me to do anything with this? Or?
No.
Okay.
I can clip.
Okay.
Okay. Well, it's a really big pleasure for us to come and talk to you about our work. It's actually really unique that we have a project like this where we create a deliverable that not only will exist in the real world, but we get to talk to people who might hopefully use it and find value in it. And so with that, no? Oh.
You have to scroll down.
Apparently.
Oh no.
Let me see if I can.
Can you control L?
Control L.
No.
No.
Other.
No. Page. Oh. No, I think it's because of the way it's. Do we still have the presentation open?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just jump into that then. Thank you for working with technical difficulties.
Internet Explorer.
Yeah. It's more than it can be.
Yes.
How many?
How many designers does it take? Guys. I can't.
Certainly not.
We use Max.
Right. Well, while they're figuring that out, just to set the agenda for today, we're kind of trying to contextualize our project. We're going to talk about our objective, our approach, but we're really going to spend some of our time talking about the process that we used. And with that process, we'll, at the end of it, show you the design of the guide that we created.
There we go. Hopefully. There it works.
Okay, perfect. So as I was saying, context, objective, and approach will be really quickly, we'll situate ourselves, then get into the process, and then actually show you the design solution. And then we're going to actually share the guide with you and then do a Q&A with it. Okay, so starting off, the project brief given to us was to create a visual design solution to explain gynecological brachytherapy. What was really key was how can we make it a graphic narrative? And really what was important was how can this now be a communication piece that's more about a discussion between a doctor and a patient. And so this is really important to us, that it's not just an explanatory message that we need to create, but an active tool that can be used. And so with that, it was really important for us to, when we were doing this project, understand like why it needed to be a graphic narrative and what was the current landscape. And the materials that are shared today are definitely, because of the nature of the information being shared, they are text heavy, and they tend to fall into a NIH recommendation level, way over the grade level. And that's actually it's really important because it's not about education level or ability for reading, but it's that medical context that for everyday people like us, it's really hard to comprehend some of that information. In the visuals that I usually use, they also have stock images. When we were talking to people, we even heard somebody say that, you know, when I look at that, I look at this person laughing or smiling, and I don't really know what that has to do with me and my experience. The other elements of it are also that sometimes the information is highly generalized. There's no connection of like what this information has to do with me. So we're trying to think about all of that stuff. And the last thing really being that when you think of this material that's handed off to a patient, it's really not inviting in a conversation. It's very unidirectional. It's just giving somebody information. And so as Dr. Dan mentioned, this is not the first time we've tried to do that. With external beam radiation therapy, a team before us sort of worked on translating that complex information into a visual narrative. It folded and it lives like an actual real piece. An apology for the images because we're using Google Slides. They're going to be a little bit blurry. But to give you a context of who we are, I think Dr. Tomoko really said us well. We are a communication design class, so to give you some context, we had 14 weeks to do this project, which meant we had to really quickly make decisions about what our objective was going to be, the scope that we wanted to go for. And our process, because the design that we do really requires us to go from understanding the context all the way till designing the solution. And we had to sort of figure out our process to do that very well. So we're going to share that with you. And with that, when we were given this design brief, the objective that really appealed to us was we needed to improve the patient experience. We knew that the scope needed to be this discussion guide because that's what we can impact. We can't change the experience that the patients go through. We can only create this communication tool. And then the outcomes that we were hoping to reach is really about helping set expectations as well as sort of empowering patients to seek the care that they deserve. And I feel like that's something that we all want to reach towards. And so part of the way that we do design is we use frameworks. This is a framework developed by a communication design professor, which says that a communication piece, you might think of it as the content that lives, but actually what informs it, along with the content, is the user needs that you discussed, as well as the context that it would be used in. And this framework is really helpful in figuring out what kind of information we need to gather to be able to get there at the end. And going into the project, there were some considerations that we were already provided. At the content level, we knew it was going to be a graphic narrative, but we needed to balance that tension with what a text can do. We needed to figure out how much of it could be generalizable, what would be customizable. We also needed to figure out readability level is something that we wanted to impact, but we also didn't want to lose accuracy. And that's what medical terminology provides. And so we needed to balance those tensions at the user needs level. We knew that we needed to go talk to people, understand what their stakeholders were feeling, but going in, some things about this context. We knew that it's anxiety provoking as a particular procedure. There's a lot of information that is provided to you, and being a patient, you aren't really always in the position of power. And so how do you navigate that relationship? We also knew in the context, as Dr. Dan has sort of elucidated, we wanted it to be facilitated doctor-patient dialogue, but this we're hoping is used across clinics. And we also wanted to imagine it as part of a larger ecosystem of education materials. So we knew this going into this project, and it was really important for us. But we also wanted to sort of point out why we, as designers, were really suited to do this well. At the context level, we really focus on making things tangible. So yes, we do all this thinking part, figuring out what people need, but we really always actualize it into making something tangible, because then we can give it to Dr. Hassan and be like, what do you think? What works, what doesn't work? We also, as Tumoko's background says, simplified complexity, but that really means us sort of gauging through how much can we abstract this information? What can the illustration allow us to do? What can text allow us to do? What can we play with? At the user needs and context level, we're constantly thinking of stakeholders. We're thinking about the patient, we're thinking about the doctor, we're thinking about the medical staff, and these are all the people we spoke with because of that, because we wanted to learn from all of their perspectives when we created this tool. And at the end of the day, we really, really want to advocate for the users. At top of our mind is how does this tool really enable that patient experience and improve it. And so with that, I'm sort of like situating our approach, but I'm going to hand it off to Seva to share with us how does our process actually manifest, and then you can start seeing some of the details of what we do.
Okay. So as Prachi mentioned, we had 14 weeks to complete this project, and this is kind of a snapshot of our process. Mapped down here below is the design process that we had originally planned, and obviously it did not go according to plan. So I'll walk you through the stages that we went through, from understanding context and understanding experience through actually making it tangible. We had quite a rigorous process, so as I go through the stages, I'll also mention the activities and the outcomes of each of the phases. This was our lab that we worked in for 3.5 months. It was really important for us to have a really immersive space to work in. It was really useful to have everything printed out really big, have it immediately visually available right in front of us. It helped us do all of these things here, align team members. We had to visualize all of this complex information. A lot of us think visually as well, so that was really useful to us. It was a really easy way to share viewpoints very quickly. And I think perhaps most importantly, it was very useful to actually track our progress as we moved through this, especially as we got towards the end. It started moving very quickly. It didn't always look like that. I know it looks really complicated and colorful, but we actually started with an empty room and where we sat there and we reviewed literature. So we read papers on the use of graphic narratives in healthcare, how visualization is helping patient education with treatment, and we also took a look at the existing gynecological brachytherapy materials that exist currently. Another thing that was very helpful for us was actually attending presentations by Dr. Dan, Dr. Hassan, Dr. Callender gave us a presentation, and also Dr. Nita. And this really helped us really immerse ourselves in the space and acquire all of this knowledge that we didn't have before. Another thing that really helped us understand the patient perspective was actually walking through the hospital here. We went to all of the rooms that a patient might typically go through. Ritu showed us all of the tools, we absorbed context, we absorbed sights and sounds that a patient might hear. This kind of helped us understand that there are 3 different treatment procedures in this: interstitial, tandem ovoid, and cylinder. So we had a lot of new knowledge in our heads, and to kind of make any kind of sense of it, we came back to our space and we printed it all out on a giant user journey, which unfortunately isn't being shown very well here. And like I said, we broke it down into interstitial, tandem ovoid, and cylinder, and the horizontal axis shows the treatment phases. So for example, this chunk here talks about all of the things things that happen between the consult phase and here is treatment, and it goes on further to show what happens during aftercare and what happens when patients actually go home. And color coding also helped us figure out who was in the patient, who was in the room with the patient, who was doing what at what stage. And it also helped us kind of validate our understanding and figure out that there really is a difference between cylinder and interstitial, for example. Cylinder is a much shorter process. The treatment delivery happens immediately after the insertion, whereas there's a lot more that happens for interstitial. And this was what helped us realize that we needed to have 3 different guides for each of the treatment processes. There was no way we could fit it all into one guide. So with all of this new knowledge in our heads, we moved on to understanding the actual experience of our stakeholders. We wrote down questions that we wanted to ask, we created interview protocols, and we went and spoke to as many stakeholders as we could. And to get a holistic perspective, we spoke to people across 4 different groups here. So non-patient patient, non-medical patient support, the patient-facing medical staff as well as non-patient-facing medical staff, and then of course, probably the most important here was the patients themselves. We heard a lot of insights, we heard a lot of stories, and we got a lot of insights from them. We pulled together our transcripts and we pulled out insights from them. One of the things I remember hearing was based on this activity that we did with our interviewers, where we asked them to give us a sense of how they feel supported throughout their journey. Something surprising was that many times patients put social workers way out here at the end. And when we actually put an insight to that, we found that sometimes patients feel that seeking support from social workers or therapists kind of makes them feel like they're not dealing with the treatment as well as they should be. So we mapped out things like that on this Excel sheet here. We synthesized our interviews, and this helped us move forward to actually creating a physical document. So I have a couple of insights to show you actually. We mapped them out on different cards like this. We had so many insights that we had to find a way to categorize them. So color coding them helped, for example. Another thing that helped was categorizing them across activity and ambition, anxiety, and attitudes of different stakeholders. And we grouped them according to whether those insights would best be represented either in a text format or an illustration format, whether some of them had to be in a customized information section, or if some of them were related to resources that were available to patients. So before moving forward to the final deliverable, which I'm sure you guys are waiting to see, we actually found that there were some design principles that were key to represent across all of the 3 different discussion guides. So, for example, one we really needed to show was, in some way or the other, each guide had to prepare patients to avoid unpleasant surprises. I remember Dr. Hassan, you told us that often patients don't realize that there's a pelvic exam included in the initial consult. Patients might think that that's just a time for doctors to chat with them. So that was something that we addressed in the guide. Another thing was, how can we prompt patients to seek care? Patients, like I said before, kind of hesitated to seek out help from social workers. We found that a lot of women who wanted to kind of keep their independent lifestyle going felt that independence was taken away if they seeked out care. And then also, how can we help alleviate anxiety with patients? So one of the things that we heard was, while patients are in the hospital, they have all of this support around them and they can call someone for help immediately, but when they go away, when they go back home, they feel that structure falls away and they feel anxiety at that time. So making patients aware that that's a time when you might feel anxiety or you might feel fatigue. So these were the things that we really wanted to include and address in all of our guides. So finally, we actually put pen to paper and we started illustrating things. We referenced our journey map from before, we referenced our insights, we referenced our design principles, and we started making really basic illustrations on Post-it notes. also figured out which things should perhaps go into speech bubbles, which things should go as subtext and captions. And we also explored with forms. So again, I have some examples where we try to figure out different ways of folding things. So these needed to be really easy to be produced. No one has time to die cut, for example. So we figured, which is going to be the easiest way for doctors to use it, which is going to be the easiest way for patients to use it. How is information going to flow in the most intuitive and logical way? And we had a lot of help from doctors at this stage. We came back to them and we showed them some of the things in which they said, this may make sense to you, but when I'm actually out there using this guide and speaking to patients, that's not going to work for me. So we went back and we iterated things like that. So moving into the challenges that we faced, this is never a linear process, and we knew that right at the start, and it wasn't. We had challenges along the way. On a content level, for example, we were dealing with issues like using medical jargon versus layman's terms. So should we call it brachytherapy or should we call it internal radiation? On an information architecture level, 3 different applicator types, 3 different treatment types were all meant to be placed on the same 11 by 17 page restriction. How do you do that? Like I said, interstitial there was just so much more information than cylinder, for example. How do we squeeze all of that in without making it too overwhelming for patients? And then on an operational level, things that make sense to us as designers didn't make sense for doctors to use, for example. So addressing those issues, and we hopefully resolved them in our final guide, which I'll hand it over to Brian to show you.
So I'm going to go into the anatomy of the guide. So the full printed size, and I have a sheet here, is printed on tabloid size 11 by 17. There. That then is folded in half to an 8.5 11 size. This can be included in folders if you have other materials that you're providing. And as you can see here, there's the beginning section that flips open into a main journey section that then ends with personalized information that I'll get into a little bit more specifically. So as we said earlier as well, we have 3 different versions we decided to create for cylinder, tandem, and overlying interstitial, since there was so much that wasn't the same that it would be hard to fit it all in one guide, but there is some overlap between them. But they each have a cohesive similarity in the layout, with cylinder varying a little bit because of how the procedure is structured. And then also, as mentioned earlier, the NIH recommended reading level with the current materials, it's very far from that right now, around 12th to 15th grade reading level. So we tried to bring down the reading level for each of these, and as you can see, 4.6 for cylinder, 6.2 for tandem and ovoid, and 7.0 for interstitial. So to explain a little bit of how each of these discussion guides work, they have 3 main sections for each of them, and flow a little bit differently, but they each have an introduction, they each have a journey, and they each have the My Information section, which I'm going to go dive into now. So to start off, this is cylinder for an example, but each of them have a general overview of brachytherapy, explaining what HDR brachytherapy is, how internal radiation is different than external radiation, as well as a spot to start discussing in the consult. And one of the things mentioned earlier is not understanding that there's a pelvic exam. So pulling out, like, I'm going to do a pelvic exam to determine the best treatment for you, making the patient aware that this is going to be happening so it's less of a surprise. And then also showing an area down in the bottom that is an area for sketching for a medical staff or the doctor who's explaining brachytherapy to go in a little bit more detail. There's a light overlay of the female anatomy, kind of hard to see on the screen here, but it's able to be drawn on by the doctor to kind of explain more specific to what this patient is going to be looking at. And then also a section that we think is important based on our research, that the resources available to them. So they make sure that if they need someone to talk to or a social worker, like this is there for them, even if they don't necessarily want to reach out immediately. And then also important logistics such as don't forget about transportation, like your insurance, billing, don't forget about these other things that you might not remember during this hectic time. So that's like the introduction section of this that then leads into the journey section, which it tells you to flip over, which leads into this middle section here, which each version has its own journey, but it is separated into logical chunks, such as planning for treatment, undergoing treatment, and managing treatment. And here you can see there's the planning for treatment section and the undergoing treatment, and then below will continue into the managing treatment, but just so you can see a close-up look how they're segmented out so they can kind of quickly see like what each section is. And then with this, we wanted to also provide through our illustrations a way for experiential visuals, so they could see these visuals and they could connect more with how they might be going through the treatment process. So instead of just reading text, they can see these illustrations and see, oh, I'm going to be in a similar situation to this. And then also just having the opportunity for the doctors to point out certain parts when they're talking to them, like, oh, like in this part you're going to be doing this, or the patient can say, well, in this part, and point to it and ask a question about a specific illustration on what's going to be happening there. So it's really focused on that discussion between the medical staff and the patient. And then on the third section, which is on the back, so after the journey, you'll close it back up, and you have some follow-up information, as well as the main section on the back is their information, called My Information. And this section is about, it has three main chunks, but it's a checklist to keep track of the treatments that they have to have coming up, so a way for the medical staff to work with them to let them list out what their following treatments are going to be, as well as how they can prepare for their treatment days. So when they might have to get simulation scans, depending on what type of brachytherapy they're getting, and certain tests they might have to get ahead of time, basically a checklist for them to make sure that they're doing these things that they need to do ahead of time. And this again is a discussion piece for the medical staff to have with them, not just to be given and hope that they do it themselves, but to like initiate a conversation, even starting in the consult. And then a third section on this, this would be specific to the clinic. So this is a spot that a label could be put from different clinics that has important numbers to call for different areas such as medical, billing, insurance, or scheduling appointments to be customized to different clinics. So not just specific to, say, University of Chicago Medicine, but other clinics as well. And then I'm going to go dive a little bit deeper and zoom in a little bit on what design insights that we found that led to our final decisions that we made. So we're going to go back to this framework real quick on the content user needs in context, and I'm going to dive into each of these and show what insights connect to each of these. So for content, we found it important based on our research, even walking through, talking to patients and medical staff. There's a lot happening during certain parts of the treatment process, such as treatment delivery. There's a lot of noises there's different noises they might hear, such as monitors connected to them or beeping from the afterloader they're connected to, as well as there's microphones set up to hear them and audio feedback, as well as a way to help provide more information in them is to show certain things in a visual format to lead to a discussion between the medical staff. So for this specific example, I believe it's a cylinder, it's showing the seed going in at the beginning of that treatment delivery, and then at the end of it, it shows it coming back out. So that can lead into a discussion between medical staff and patients to help explain things that might not be easy to explain, just as one example. And then another content level insight was having the patient be able to understand specific to them what they need to do. So again, going back to that My Information section and pointing out specific to their type of treatment, here's some things you may have to do. And that's something that a doctor could walk through with them and say, you're gonna need these types of things for your treatment, and make sure that they have that conversation. And then another one for content level is combining both illustration and text together to re-emphasize certain points. So for the patient to understand that they're gonna be, for this as an example, they're gonna be alone in the room, it's not only visually showing people walking in one direction, but leaving the room, but also in text saying that they're gonna step out of the room right now, but we can hear and see you. So emphasizing the same point with multiple formats. Which leads me, and these are just a few examples of insights, these are not all of them, but just to explain some of them. For the user needs level, we heard that a patient-facing non-medical staff, I believe, would provide pen and paper to patients to help them write down and remember questions they might have later. So we thought, why not reduce the number of different pieces of things that they have to write down on and everything. So how do we include that in our guide? So on that back page, there is a section that's patient notes and questions. So if they leave the clinic and they think of questions when they're at home, they can write these down, bring this guide back with them. It's again emphasizing that this is not a one-time use look at. It's keep bringing it with you for each of your treatments. If you have any questions, bring them back, talk to your doctor. We wanted to avoid surprises for the patient, so making sure to call out the different processes and make it understandable that, like, okay, you're waiting for a few hours, such as for Tino, they might wait for a few hours while they plan the treatment, the day of treatment. Or for interstitial, they're waiting several hours. So like explaining, like while they're planning, you're waiting in this other room and how things are happening at the same time. So avoid that surprise that you're gonna possibly be waiting for a while, as well as just explaining when treatment delivery is actually happening to avoid the misconception of like, when is the actual treatment happening? Is it earlier in that day, or when is it? So it's helping to clarify things like that. And then also helping to dispel misconceptions about radiation, if they're radioactive, when are they radioactive? So we have this striped yellow and black radiation strip that is on the guide specifically during when treatment delivery is happening, and saying like this is the only point where Jane is the sample person in the guide. Jane is radioactive, to make sure that they know that this is the only point that they're going to be radioactive when the treatment delivery is happening. And we also call out in different areas, like you're not radioactive at this time, to make sure that they understand they're not gonna leave there and be radioactive. And we also wanted to make sure that family members and friends can advocate for the patient. So including in illustrations, showing like family members or friends like that they can also be a part of this entire process, just calling out so they know that like they don't have to be alone through this process. And one of the things that we noticed in our patient interview is that they didn't know that they could have friends or family during certain parts of the time there with them. So they spent the time waiting, such for like 3 hours alone, when they could have had someone with them at that point. So it's emphasizing that as well. And then on the context level, this is thinking of the bigger picture, thinking of like that this is a livable document. Again, emphasizing certain things such as your checklist, making sure it's something that you discuss between doctor and patient. The sketch pad, which again, it allows the doctor to not only inform during the meeting to write on it, but we learned through interviews and discussions that when a medical staff writes on the document, it becomes that much more valuable to the patient. And it would make it so they might remember to then keep bringing this back to like, oh, the doctor wrote on that, I must need that, I should probably bring that back, or keep looking at it. And then thinking about everything beyond the procedure, like what they have to do at home, such as reminding them, like, don't forget your appointments. We learned that like sometimes patients might miss appointments, and having the emphasis that like you should remember to keep your appointments. It's very crucial for your treatment that you need to come during certain times. And then also, if you have any like symptoms or anything like that, to just make sure that like you can call, like you can contact them to make sure that they don't feel like they're alone once they get back home, since it's different than when they're surrounded by the medical staff when they're in for the actual treatment. And then one last thing is, there's some sections that are highlighted in gray throughout the different guides that account for variability depending on the specific treatment for the patient or if there are different clinics. This is just one example, but it's thinking, one example is tandem and ovoid. They may need a sleeve inserted depending on what clinic they're going to. So it's accounting for things like that. Like you may need a sleeve inserted, but it's not a definite. So they make sure to understand that there's certain cases that they have to do certain things. But again, that's a way for the doctor to explain like, okay, you're in our clinic. This is applying to you then, but it's just calling that out as a possibility. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some bigger points to pull out. And then Patrick's going to go into next steps.
We're at the end essentially at this point, but we just wanted to call out that we talked about the people we spoke with, but we had talked to only 4 patients. We've tried to talk with a lot more, but it's just because of scheduling and the way things work out within the 14 weeks. So for CoGBE itself, we would love to get additional feedback, revisions. I think the next steps would look, there might be an analysis study and other things. We also think that based on conversation with Dr. Nanda, there will be more discussion guides of this form based on different things. There seems to be a grant awarded for it as well. And then lastly, for graphic narratives itself, there might be an extension into other clinical disciplines. So we hope this teaser has been interesting and engaging. But with that, we're actually going to move into, we actually really want questions if